Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Honshu. This game was designed by Keimao Miyoja, and it is a card game set in feudal Japan where you have a mixture of trick-taking as well as tile-laying, because first you play the cards into tricks, and then once they are out on the table, they can be picked up and either tucked underneath your previous cards or put back on top in order to build beautiful maps, and based on how you put those cards down, you will score points in a variety of ways. First, I'll show you how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. Here we have the start of a 4-player game of Honshu. Each player randomly gets a player order card as well as one of these starting cards. Each one of these cards is going to have spots for 2 of these resource cubes, which you can just put right down onto them, and then each player is also given a hand of 6 cards. Each turn of Honshu is split up into 2 phases, the first being a card-playing trick-taking phase. You'll notice all of the cards have a value, numerical value in the top part, and what happens here is we start with the starting player, and they choose one card from their hand, and they'll put it face up in the middle of the table, and they will go to the second player. So, for instance, this first player might, say, take this card right here that is a value of 54. They put this face up in front of them, and that means that the value of this card is 54. They could now choose to discard one of their colored cubes and put it on top of this card, which would add 60 to the value of this card. So instead of 54, it would now be 114, but they would no longer get access to this brown cube, and now it moves to the next player. So, for instance, this player might look at their hand, and they see that they have a 53 as their highest value, and then some lower ones. They could potentially play this 27, for instance, and now they also have the option of discarding a cube because they have this brown. It's important to note you always have to follow the color of a discarded cube once one person does it. So for the rest of this round, only brown cubes can be discarded, but let's just say that this player decides not to do that, and now let's see what the other players decide to pick. Now that every player has selected one card, we can kind of push these into the middle of the pool, and we now see who won the trick. We see that at 114, this player certainly has the highest value, so they keep the 1. The second value up here is going to be the 57, which means that this player is now going to be going second. Next up, we have the 27, which means that this player will go third. And finally, with 12, this player over here will go fourth. We can now discard any cubes that were used for bidding, and starting with the first player, they get to pick one of these 4 cards, and they are going to put that card into their starting tableau over here. So in this instance, the player might choose to take this 54, and now it would go to the second player, who gets to pick one card from these 3 here. They might grab this 57. Now the third player picks from these 2 here. They might decide to take the 12, and finally, the fourth player does not get a choice. They just take this card. At this point, all the players can simultaneously figure out how they are going to put these cards into their starting map area. There are only 2 placement rules when it comes to putting new cards into your overall map area. The first is that this new card must either cover up 1 square of a previous card or tuck under so that at least 1 square on the new card is covered up by 1 previous card, or the other rule is if any cards have this water symbol on them, you can never tuck this water under, and you can never cover it either. So you'd be not able to do something like this. You can instead do something like this, and in the future, you would not be allowed to put another card on top. So, keeping these 2 things in mind, there are a variety of different ways you can actually play this card. We could, for instance, do this so that we have all these cities next to each other, but we would then be getting rid of this little factory. We could also play this card like this, so we're covering up some of this yellow desert, which we don't really care about, but probably a really good move would be to do this. It's illegal because we covered up at least 1 square, and now we have our cities next to each other. And this is important because when you look at the scoring card, there are 4 main ways that you always score points in a game of Honshu. This second one here says that you get 1 point for each of the pieces of cities in your largest set of adjacent city spots. So by putting this here, we have a large city of 5, and each one of these spots is going to be worth 1 point. If we had another city that is not connected to this, then of course they're going to compete, so the goal of the game is trying to connect all of your city tiles into one really big city to score a bunch of points. You'll also note that you get 2 points for every face-up forest at the end of the game. And then down here, we show that we can consume cubes into factories to get 2 to 4 points. Now you'll notice this card right here has a little star symbol around it and 2 of these flowers. If we were able to acquire a yellow cube later on in the game, for instance by playing this card right here, then when the game is over, if we still have this yellow cube here, it can be transferred over to this yellow cube factory and turned into 2 points. But it's important to note that each factory can only take 1 cube. Lastly, we have scoring for the water sections, and you'll note that a single water section by itself is worth no points, but as soon as you have more than 1 water section next to each other, any second, third, and on water chunks will get you 3 points each. So if we were to have this card right here, and we could maybe put it right there, I'm not sure why we would, because that would kill this cube, but that is a legal thing we could do, then this water is worth nothing. But in the future, if we came along and were able to maybe tuck this card like this water spot right here is now worth 3 points, as will any future water spots that are adjacent to this growing water region. The last thing to note for scoring is that the game comes with 8 optional endgame scoring cards, and you can pick one of these and all players will be scored on that specific card, and it is just one more way that you can get points. For instance, if you played with this one, then in addition to getting these 4 scoring opportunities, you would also get 4 points for each line of 3/4 that go in a row in your overall area. At this point, obviously we would have none, but this would incentivize us to try and put 3/4 in a straight line to get those bonus points. Once all players have placed their card, we'll move into the second round of the game. We start with the first player again, and they once again pick one card from their hand and put it into the middle, trying to win the trick. It's important to note that once you play the first 3 rounds of the game and you have 3 cards in your hand, at this point you actually pass all these cards over to your opponent onto your side, and then you will get 3 cards back from your neighbor. At this point, you will play all 3 of these rounds until you have no cards, and then you'll deal out 6 cards to every player again, and you'll be halfway through the game. You'll play 3 cards, you will then trade those 3 cards to opponents, play the last 3 cards, and the game will be over once everybody has played 12 rounds. Once the game is over, everybody looks at all the cards they have in front of them, they check all their different scoring conditions, they add up all these points, and the person who has the most is the winner. Let's now begin the review for Honshu by starting with a couple positive points. And the first of these relates to the really cool twist that this game brings to tiling with the either tucking under or covering over aspect to putting your cards down. This game does feel like a tile-laying game in general. You're doing tile-laying stuff like trying to get certain icons next to each other and having challenges to try and fit things in, but with the added ability to slide these cards underneath or cover up large portions of other cards that are already in front of you, it just explodes the decision space. You have so many different things you can think about, and it does kind of bring it back down a little bit by forcing you to never cover up the water spaces. So this is an interesting extra thing that you have to think about, and oftentimes it's a little bit frustrating, but in an interesting way, because you just can't quite get the card to tuck in just the specific way because of that pesky little water spot there. But I'm happy for that because it does constrain your decision space a little bit and keep your options interesting. You obviously have to think about how you're going to play this one card you have in front of you, and you can do tons of different stuff with that one card. But then, of course, you are also thinking about which of the cards in the middle do you want to take, as long as you are not last in the trick-taking aspect to the round. So it's just a really cool twist on how you actually build up this little map in front of you, and as an added bonus, it makes some pretty interesting shaped tile areas. You know, if you are playing a hexagonal tile-laying game, well, odds are good you're going to have a little grid that looks like a bunch of hexagons. But in this one, I've seen some really wonky stuff because of the ways you can tuck almost all of a card or not and kind of splay off in weird diagonals. It makes for really cool maps and really great decisions. For positive number 2, I want to discuss the cubes and the competing desires that you have for using these. Because on the one hand, you might be able to consume these into a factory at the end of the game in order to get a reasonable amount of points, as long as you have the matching factory. But on the other hand, you can discard that cube in order to get a massive 60-point bonus to the trick that you're putting down, the card that you're putting into the trick. And this is a very strong benefit to putting that card down. It's going to definitely put you into a situation where you have some options in front of you. More often than not, I found when people put a cube down, they're actually the one who overall wins because, well, there is this other factor when it comes to discarding the cubes to put them in the middle, and that is for your opponents. If they want to also discard a cube in order to potentially match you and maybe even beat you in that one trick-taking round, they have to discard the same color cube, which I think is a nod towards following suit in trick-taking style games, which this game is obviously emulating to a certain extent. And for them, they may already have a really good factory for that one specific color cube, and they really need to decide, is it worth getting rid of the cube, hoping they can figure out a way to get a new one of that color later on in the game, in order to get the priority for grabbing the cards that are in the middle of the table at that one specific moment, or of course, the card that they're putting down right then. And when you are deciding what card you want to, cube you want to discard, if nobody has discarded any yet, you oftentimes have situations where you look down and you realize you have a couple cubes that don't match any of your factories, and maybe you don't see strong factories out in the middle. Maybe you have a factory for it, but it's only like 2 points, and you're not sure if that card works for the rest of your map anyway. And so sometimes it's actually relatively painless to discard a cube for yourself to get a really good position in this round, but that one color cube might be super painful for one of your opponents. So it's a neat push and pull of desires, figuring out how you want to best utilize the cubes in front of you. You certainly don't want to end the game with cubes on your area that don't get consumed into factories. So you are doing this balancing act, and I quite enjoy that. Let's now move into a couple neutral points, and the first of these has to do with the optional endgame scoring cards. Now, on the face of it, I really love the addition of these into the game. There are 8 of them in the box, and it means that when you sit down to play the game, it's going to be different than the last one because you're gunning for a different alternate scoring condition in addition to all of the standard scoring conditions. The reason this is more of a neutral point than a positive, though, is because I really like some of these way more than others. I feel like the ones that are focused around making specific patterns in your map area are great because they add into those great decisions of putting your cards down and how you're going to tuck them. But you have others that just maybe give you a couple points for consuming a specific type of good into a specific type of factory. That's less interesting to me. I know that it means that the tension of trying to get those specific factories and those specific cubes is going to be higher because they're worth more points, but I just find that less engaging. Probably my least favorite one just changes the scoring for the water spots so that you just get 2 points per water spot as opposed to trying to put the water spots all next to each other. And I guess this really does all come back to my love of the tile laying aspects and not necessarily for the specific card playing parts of the game. So for some people, they might really enjoy those other endgame scoring optional cards that I don't so much because they enjoy a different part of the game more than I necessarily do. But in general, I just wish there were more of these that had to do with making interesting patterns with the tiles in front of you. I think that really is an awesome part of the game. And honestly, if the game had shipped with just 4 scoring cards instead of 8, and all 4 of those had to do with this, I wouldn't be complaining, and I'd say, hey, there's 4 different ways to play this game, that's great. So it's a little bit of a weird thing to be complaining about, which is why this is a neutral point, but I thought it was worth mentioning. And now we have neutral number 2, which is pretty simple. Once you get into the later stages of the game, it can be a little hard to remember where all your cubes are and where all your factories are and how you're going to be scoring your different cubes. The game just gets really big, and I feel like it can be a little confusing trying to figure out where exactly you stand, especially if you're trying to figure out which of your cubes you might be discarding in order to do a really good bid when you're going in for the trick. So I found myself wanting to actually put the cubes on the factories themselves so I can kind of track how many factories are used and how many aren't. And then if I want to consume a cube, well, I will get rid of it. And the only real issue you have with this is with one specific optional endgame scoring card that has to do with empty factory slots, although I suppose you could kind of move the tokens back and forth in that way. So this is not a very big deal, but it's worth mentioning that near the end of the game, you have a very big area, and it can be a little bit tough. You're going to be really spinning your gears trying to make sure you keep everything in your mind and all your different plans come to fruition when the game ends. You certainly don't want to be in a situation where you thought you had a specific cube or a specific factory that you didn't, just because you got a little bit lost looking at all the cards that you have in front of you. Let's now move into the negative segment, and I have a couple of these I want to discuss. The first is much bigger than the second, and that has to do with the overall trick-taking phase to the game. I just don't like it that much. This, in reality, is a 2-part game. You have trick-taking, and then you have the tile laying. And the trick-taking really does feel like a way of just getting these cards into players' hands so that they can then have the great decisions of figuring out how you're going to put it into your map area and satisfying all of the scoring conditions. But actually playing into those tricks, I just don't like that much. I don't like looking at all the different cards and figuring out which number is bigger, and okay, do I want to go higher than that one person or go lower? Do I care? And I look at all these different cards in my hand and their different orientations of all the different icons, and I suppose there are interesting decisions to be had there, trying to figure out which card is the right one to put down, and if you really want this card that's in your hand, okay, well, you put it down, then maybe you discard a cube. And again, I love the cube discarding mechanic. I think that's a really great way of using this one specific resource, but I just don't like the trick-taking phase to the game at all. I feel like there has got to be a more interesting way of acquiring these cards into your area. Maybe you could spend the cubes you have in your tableau in some sort of bidding phase, or just having some sort of sliding row where you take them and the values go up and down with those cards. I feel like there are lots of different ways you could latch on a different card acquisition model and probably have a more satisfying game experience for me. It is worth mentioning that I am not crazy about trick-taking games in general. I don't mind them. I've played many of them, and it's not like I will not play a trick-taking game or I will dislike a game just because it has trick-taking, but I think it has a larger mountain to climb to get over a slight anti-disposition towards trick-taking. I feel like when I'm sitting down to play card games, I'm much more interested in a ladder climbing style game than trick-taking, for instance. And that is a good thing to know when you're going into figuring out my opinion and how that applies to your opinion of this game. If you love trick-taking games, then odds are pretty good you are going to enjoy this phase of the game. But if you are just kind of on the fence with trick-taking, it's possible that you will feel, as I do, that there was probably a better way to facilitate these cards into our areas, to have those decisions, to put them down. Because realistically, that map feels like that is what this game is about. And I feel like that should be like 75% of the game to 25% of getting the cards, as opposed to the 50-50 that it feels like right now. For negative number 2, I want to discuss the card passing mechanic. And of course, this plays into the overall trick-taking style to the game, but specifically, you pass these cards twice while you are playing the game. And if you remember, you deal out 6 cards to every player at the beginning of the game, you play 3 rounds, and then you pass your remaining 3 cards over to your opponent, and then you play 3 more rounds, and then you deal out 6 cards and do that again. And the issue that I have with this is that I think it also weakens the overall trick-taking decisions that you have while you are playing the game, because it feels like everybody wants to play their 3 highest cards in the beginning of the round so they don't pass high cards to their opponents so that their opponent does well in that later stage. I'm not saying that I've never seen anybody play low cards in those first 3 rounds, but by doing that, by definition, you are giving a higher value card to an opponent so that it's kind of a gift over to that person, and maybe you're playing that low value card because it's just perfect for the map that you have in front of you, and you want to make sure that you grab that card, maybe by discarding a cube, because if it's a low value card, then somebody else might come in and snipe it before you. But I just think this game would probably be more interesting, and certainly the trick-taking aspect of the game would be more interesting to me if you just had to play out your 6 cards. So maybe you go really low early and then high later, or you need to pick and choose your moments to do this, whereas right now it kind of felt like I was playing 2 different hands of 3 cards, where I'm like, okay, these are the 3 highest cards, what order am I going to play them? And then, well, I'm just not even going to be playing these, and I get some more from my opponent. It's certainly possible that this is groupthink for the people that I've played it, but I just can't help but feel like the mechanics are really incentivizing you to play that way, and I don't really like that. Let's now discuss the variability for Honshu, and I think that it is slightly above average. When you think about those variable endgame optional scoring cards, if the game had shipped without those, I feel like it would be average, because you are still going to play slightly different games each time you sit down because of the variety of cards that are going to come into your hand and also come into play when you are pulling them out of the trick-taking phase. So one game you might go heavy with big cities, and another game you might have lots of factories and cubes just based off of that. But then it is certainly a nice added bonus having these optional endgame scoring cards, and I feel like if more of them were stronger and more interesting to me, then this would be a higher endorsement of the overall variability. But yeah, it's slightly above average, and that is certainly a good thing. Honshu plays 2 to 5 players, and I've played 2, 3, and 4 player games, and I feel like the ideal player count is probably 4 players, because I really enjoy the variety of cards that you can grab after the trick-taking phase. I also like that with that added player, it means if you play a lower card, you are less likely to be the lowest, so that you have a decision to be made between those couple cards, but it was okay at the 3-player game as well. The 2-player game is fine, but it's a little wonky, and it brings in a whole different set of rules for the trick-taking phase, because now it's actually simultaneous selection, so you have that feeling of, is my opponent going to go high or is it going to go low? You also have a couple random cards dealt out from the top of the stack, and when you win the trick, you choose one of these 2 stacks of 2 cards, and then you pick 1 card from those 2, so there are a variety of different decisions to be made when you're playing it at the 2-player game, but it does feel different, and honestly, it feels like this game was designed for the 3 to 5 player experience, and they figured out a way to make 2-player work. And I wouldn't say that 2-player is bad, but it's definitely a little odd. And I've never played it at 5 players, but I have seen it played at 5 players, and this game can go a little long at that respect, especially considering there could be a bit of analysis paralysis at certain points when you are getting really big tableaus. Also, having 5 cards in the middle, which one are you going to pick? But I think the increased variety means that a 4-player game is still going to be slightly stronger than the 3-player game, even though that will also be a longer experience than the 3-player game overall. In conclusion, I've played Honshu 5 times, and I've enjoyed all 5 of those plays, but I feel like this has been largely on the back of the wonderful decisions that come into play with figuring out where you're going to put this card into your overall growing map. Are you going to tuck it? Are you going to put it on top of your other cards? You're working towards a variety of different scoring conditions, including one that is different each time you sit down to play the game. There's just some really, really great stuff there, but I'm not crazy about how you actually acquire that card. This is the trick-taking method where you are picking the card and putting it in the middle, and the person who plays the highest one is going to get a variety of choices, and if you played a low card, you're going to have a lot less choices, in fact, maybe no choice. But honestly, I feel like you could rip off that trick-taking module to this game and snap in something else that would probably work much better and feel more cohesive to the overall theme of this tile-laying game, because I do feel like that is the center part of this game, with the trick-taking kind of snapped onto the side. And my personal preference, this is something that you should definitely know, and that I am pretty neutral when it comes to trick-taking games. I'm not crazy about them, but that's not really the main reason why I don't feel like it works as well in this instance. I just feel like something else could work so much better. And, you could have like a line of cards in the middle that you maybe are bidding cubes on in order to take them, and it kind of slides down and the values increase or decrease. Or you could just go really simple and have a hand draft style game where you have 6 cards, you pull one out, you put it into your tableau and pass 5 to your opponent. In that case, I'm not sure what you do with your cubes, but somebody smarter than I could figure that out. And I feel like that would be a much more interesting game to me. And from a personal preference perspective, I'm not actually crazy about hand drafting games. I think they work in some instances and they don't work in others. And I feel like it would work actually better in this instance than the trick taking. So it is worth noting my personal preferences when it comes to these overall mechanics. And if you love trick taking games, then this is probably a big plus. Like, I don't think the trick taking is broken. I don't love the way you pass the cards in the middle of it, but the trick-taking aspect to it does work. I just feel like other things would work better. But like I said, if you love trick-taking, then this is going to be a big positive for you for the game. And overall, I think I do recommend it because I have quite enjoyed the decisions that come into the game, but specifically, I just love that tile laying part. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting this channel through Patreon, including all of these producer-level pledges. If you too would like to directly support the channel and everything I do here, you can do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and monthly vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.